Chapter 1. The land beyond the Forest Worth walk area. The land beyond. Empires there is in southeastern Europe, pressed between the great arc of the Carpathian Mountains to the north, and the broad sweep of the Danube River to the south, that has carried more weight in the imagination of the Western world than its geography. To justify, today it is Romania. In the 5th-10th century, it was the Principality of Wallachia, a Lurfland, a buffer. I stick at me call between the competing ambitions of three enormous powers. For the Ottoman Empire expanding endlessly from the south and east, the Kingdom of Hungary pressing from the north and west, and the Kingdom of Poland falling from the north to rule Wallachia in the 5th-10th century. From the eye of a geopolitical storm, the political storm. Escormists, the political quarry. The annihilation, Aquis enter the storm, the Edafor of Bruegel, Aquarmasser, Thorius and mountain-ranged Rios Orthodox in a region where Catholic Hungary and Muslim Ottoman Turkey were fighting for dominance. That Vlad II was born, and into whose ruling dynasty he would in time be admitted. Vlad II was the father of the man this story is about, but to understand the son, it's necessary first to understand the father, because the life of Vlad III Dracula, the man history would come to know, the Impaler cannot be separated from the extraordinary and valiantry and violent circumstances into which Borny, Wallachia, in the early 5th-10th century, was governed by a system that was as brutal in its internal politics as in its external conflicts. The Wallachian throne was not inherited by strict primogeniture by the rule of the eldest son, but was contested among all male members of the ruling Basarab dynasty, both legitimate and illegitimate. This meant that any male of Basarab blood was imprinted at the throne, that the throne's incumbent was perpetually threatened by rivals from within in Zwingli, as well as from external powers. The history of the Wallachian Principality in 14th and 16th at one levis is brown. At one level, a relentless chronicle of assassinations, depositions, coups, counter-coups among members of the same family Vlad III would grow up in, and this world would be shaped by it, and would himself eventually become and definitive actors. The Order of the Dragon, Vlad Dracul in 1431, 1441. The Hoover Sushiren Dupran Roman of Oxfordsenbond inducted Walt Wyman Ninchen Iman into the chivalric order of the Vladracul. An order founded by Sigismund himself. The stated purpose of defending Christendom against the expanding empire and combating heresy. The man inducted into this order was Vlad II of Wallachia, who would thereafter be known by the epithet Dracul, meaning dragon, devil, or devil, depending on the context. Because the Romanian word for dragon carries connotations. From this epithet, his sons would take the suffix ulia, meaning son of, and the eldest son, who would become the subject of the story, would be known to his contemporaries as Vlad Dracula. Add Dracula. Vlad, son of the dragon. The Order of the Dragon was not merely a ceremonial distinction. It carried with it its specific obligations to fight against Ottomans, to protect the Christian kingdoms of Central, and specific political implications. By joining the order, Vlad II was aligning himself formally with the Habsburgs and Hungarian kingdom against the Ottomans. But the political reality of Wallachia squeezed between these powers. That such an alignment could never be absolute. The Wallachian princes were perennial pragmatists, and shifting their nominal allegiances as the military balance shifted. Paying tribute Ottomans when Ottoman and military power with dominant power and aligning, and with Hungary when Hungarian power offered better protection. This double game was not cowardice. It was the only survival strategy, a tool to a small principality between giants, and it required extraordinary political skill. And it produced a climate I made up. Especially perpetual suspicion, model, irreal. Navigate it. In approximately 2028 or 1430, the exact is uncertain is her wife, Vlad II's wife, whose identity is not entirely clear in the historical record, gave birth to a son who was named Vlad after his father. This was the Vlad who would become Vlad III, who would rule Wallachia 3 separate times. Who would earn retruent through be the king. Excreme, it echoed through centuries, and eventually gave birth, in the imagination of a novelist of ein to their most enduring villain in Western popular culture. But during 430, he was simply a child, born into the most dangerous ruling family, 8, in one of the most dangerous regions of Europe. Chapter 2:20, The Hostage Years. fears, learning, power and delivered to the sortie to, in fortupian fierus to, a polaric to. A political crisis forced Vlad II into one of the most of his life. The Ottoman Anun Sultan Murad Ivuns, suspicious of Vlad I's loyalties. He had recently fought alongside Longsadlin, the Hungarian general Yanyadi, and Yathians, the Ottoman at the Battle of Jalovminita. Summoned the Wallachian prince to a meeting at Adrianople, whether by calculation or coercion. Vlad arrived at this meeting and was briefly imprisoned by the Ottomans, who then released him on condition that he'd provide assurance of his good behavior. The insurance the Ottomans demanded was concrete and personal. Two of Vlad I's sons to be held as hostages at the Ottoman court. The children delivered were Vlad, who was approximately 12 or 14 years old, and his younger brother, Raju, who was perhaps 6 or 7. The years that Vlad III spent as an Ottoman hostage, roughly from 442 to 442 through the formative years of his character, and historians have long debated their precise psychological impact. The Ottoman court at which he was held was, by any standard, one of the most sophisticated institutions in the world. The Topkapi era culture was a world of extraordinary refinement alongside extraordinary violence. A place where arts and learning flourished alongside an absolutism in which a sultan's word was literally the difference between life and death, where imperial power was expressed without apology or restraint, and where the exercise of terror was understood as a legitimate instrument of governance. Vlad's educated at the Ottoman court. He learned to speak Ottoman Turkish fluently. He observed close quarters the mechanisms of Ottoman imperial power. How a centralized, absolute authority maintained control over a vast and adverse power through a combination of military force, administrating efficiency, religious legitimacy, and in the deliberate use of intimidation. He watched executions he may have witnessed, which was used as a method of execution in Ottoman practice, though not with this elaborate method, would later develop it into. He was simultaneously subject to the Sultan's absolute power, his life contingent on his father's loyalty, and a student and a stone in Intihawth it exercised that would later be applied in Walakrithi intensi shocked, and even contemporaries accustomed to 15th, violent. The murder of a father. Returned to a changed world in 1447. While Vlad III was still a hostage at the Ottoman court. Political events in Wallachia reached a violent resolution. The Hungarian regent John Hunyadi, who had long regarded Vlad II as an unalliable ally with excessive Ottoman sympathies, arranged for his removal. Vlad II was assassinated, dragged from a swamp near Birboltani, where he had sought refuge and killed. At approximately the same time, Vlad III's older brother, Brolder Mircea II, the heir apparent to the Wallachian throne, was captured by enemies and buried. Some sources say his eyes were gouged out first. In a single violent episode, Vlad III lost both his father and his brother in his emperor, and of Wallachia passed to a rival. The news of his father's and brother's deaths reached Vlad in Ottoman captivity. He was approximately 17 years old. The psychological impact of learning, while a prisoner in foreign court, that his father had been murdered through the machinations of the very power that was supposed to be Beer's Christian protector, and that his brother had been buried alive, is not something that can be measured directly from historical record, but it is not difficult to infer. The world had already taught Vlad III that power was without sentiment, that allies could become murderers, that survival required absolute abstinence, ruthlessness. The deaths of his father and brother confirmed and amplified every lesson the Ottoman court had taught him. In 1448, the Ottomans, recognizing opportunity to install a pliant ruler in Wallachia, released Vlad III and supported his claim to the throne. He was perhaps 17 or 18 years old. His first reign lasted a matter of weeks. The political was too unstable, the forces aligned and against him too powerful, and he was quickly displaced and forced to flee to Moldavia, where he found where to court his uncle Bogdan II. He spent the following years in exile in Moldavia, then in Transylvania, under protection of John Hunyadi himself. The man whose political machinations had resulted in his father's death. This, apparently, paradoxical alliance was pure Wallachian realpolitik. Hunyadi needed a compliant Wallachian prince as a buffer against the Adens. Needed Hunyadi's support to reclaim his throne. Pragmatism overrode everything else. Chapter 3. the second reign, the terror begins return to Wallachia, Fulkorkorfian and Sikernth in 456. In 456. In 456. With Hungarian support and Hungarian support, then's own gathering of loyal forces. Vlad III moved through against the Ringlachen Prince Vladislav II, Prince Vladislav II, the man and displaced him who was associated with the political faction had arranged his father's murder. Conflict was settled in single combat, according to some sources. Vlad was killed the third term of Wallachia for the second time. He was approximately 26 years old, hardened by years of exile and toil and political survival, and possessed of a clarity about his own situation would express itself almost immediately in a series of actions that established beyond and any possibility of doubt the kind of a ruler he intended to be. The Wallachia that Vlad III inherited in 456 in orders was a principality in serious disorder. The Wallihem had become accustomed to a degree of autonomy that effectively made them independent power brokers, capable of making and breaking princes at will. The economic life of the principality was by the activities of the Saxon merchants of Transylvania, who had been using their privileged trading relationships with Wallachia to extract perms for Wallachian producers, and who frequently supported Vlad's rivals. External threats came from multitudes simultaneously. The Ottoman Empire, under the new and extraordinarily aggressive Sultan Mehmed II, who had conquered Constantinople in 1403, was pressing against Wallachia's southern border with increasing intensity, and internally, the prince, supplanted by the loyalties of a nullity and princery, and their temporary and their own survival as the paramount consideration. Vlad's response to this situation was characterized by an unwillingness to use violence on a scale went far beyond the norms of his time and place, which were not, it should be emphasized, norms of particular gentleness. He understood, with the cold Prasan, the van, a Gulfrichican, hen than the hardest possible school, that the disorders of Wallachia had wrought. The ability of individuals and groups to act against the prince's authority with impunity. His solution was to eliminate that impunity absolutely, demonstrably, through public violence, horror, that the message it carried could never be misunderstood. The instrument he chose, Impaler, was not invented by Vlad, but he would make it his own in a way that permanently attached his name to it in the history of Europe. The Easter massacre of the boyars, among the first and most significant acts of Vlad's denaction, Stiana Bavwalakshin boyar class that had been responsible ori or indirectly for the deaths of his father and brother. The timing and manner he chose were charistic, deliberate, theatrical, designed and didn't be ignored. On Easter Sunday of fall between 57, some sources place this event is in 459, and the band is set to I. Vlad invited the boyar families of Wallachia and their households to a feast at his court in Tergovisit. The invitation was accepted. The boyars, accustomed to the political rituals of the court, attend. And then Vlad gave the signal. The boyars and their families, men, women, and in some accounts children, were seized. The older boyars and those deemed unable to work were impaled on stakes outside the castle. The younger and more able-bodied were marched north to the ruins of fortress on the Arges River. Here, they were forced to labor in the construction of what Vlad's Oakwood fortress residence of Punori Castle. One of the most dramatically positioned positions in Europe, perched on a cliff above a river gorge in the foothills Carpathians. Many died during the forced march up. Those who long Husflolef and the useful labor were then, according to most sources, killed. The message was unmistakable. The boyar class that had played kingmaker in Wallachia for narrations had been eliminated as an independent political force. The scale of the Easter massacre is difficult to verify precisely from the historical sources. Numbers given in contemporary accounts range from several hundred to several thousand. And the accounts themselves, many of them written by political enemies of Vlad, or by the Saxon merchants of Transylvania, whom he had antagonized, need be treated with appropriate skepticism. What is not in doubt is that it is a portion of the traditional Volashil nobilia was killed in this period, and that the political effect, what Vlad intended, the replacement of an entrenched aristocracy whose hypocrisy, whose loyalty was conditional and whose power was a constant threat, and a prince with a new class of administrators and militaringer godikmedursing kavled perfing hutton impounded only on him continued paver and Ooks. Chapter 4. The Instruments of Terror. Parliament and its logic demand and its meaning all the instruments of violence, alls of violence, available to a 15th century ruler. Vlad III chose Impaler as his touristic mestic meth of execution and execution and public statement to understand why and to understand what Impaler meant in the context of his rule is necessary. It is necessary to look at it with the cold analytical eye of a historian rather than through the lens of the Horiot. Impalement was not chosen randomly or purely from sadism. Though the evidence strongly suggests that Vlad something more than merely political satisfaction from its use. It was chosen because of its specific qualities and communication. The mechanics of impalement as fied Vlad described in detail by multiple contemporary sources including Ottoman accounts, German pamphlets and papal correspondence, involved the insertion of a sharpened stake into the body, typically through the lower torso. Crucially, the stake used by Vlad was typically rounded and oiled at the tip, not sharpened fine point. This was not a mercy. It was a refinement of horror. A blunt stake took longer to penetrate the eye and caused as greater suffering, but it was less likely to immediately damage a vital organ, which meant the victim could remain alive on the stake for hours, or even days before dying of thirst, exposure, blood loss, or the progressive damage caused. Vlad's stakes weighed as the victims slowly sank further down it. Vlad understood and applied the principle maximum squirelums combined with prolonged suffering. The heights of the stakes were carefully graded according social rank of the victim. Of Guas, once the Bangshans, once of his violence, high-ranking officials and nobles were impaled on taller stakes, so that their bodies were visible from a greater distance, and so that the hierarchy of power and punishment was literally inscribed landscape. The arrangement of impaled bodies in the specific patterns that contemporary accounts describe forests of stakes, bodies arranged in concentric circles, specific groupings designed to communicate specific messimistes. Straits a deliberate orchestration of terror that went far beyond simple execution and into something approaching of language, of violence, of public communication, whose grammar was understood. Everyone who saw it, the forest of the impaled, facing the Alameda. It is the most famous and most thoroughly documented single act of Vlad's impalement as a weapon of deconolensicology. Warfare Wiederensingensonst for during S62 during his conflict with the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. In the spring of that year, Mehmed led an enormous Ottoman army. Estimates vary, but most historians accept a figure of at least 60,000 men, and possibly considerably more. Northward across the Danube into Vlad III, ending to end the problem of Vlad III's and definitively and install a compliant ruler of all action throne. Vlad's own forces were far smaller, perhaps 10 to 30,000 men at most. And he recognized that he could not defeat Mehmed in open battle. His response to the Ottoman advance was a campaign of asymmetric warfare remarkable for its strategic sophistication. A scorched earth policy that denied the invading army food and water. Series of night raids and ambushes designed to inflict casualties and undermine Ottoman morale, and the deliberate poisoning of wells and contamination of our nation and the army's path. The most famous episode of this campaign occurred near the Wallachian capital of Tergovicit. As the Ottoman vanguard approached the city, stopped them in their tracks and produced a stint of stack and of Horan warriors. Ottoman was a state of shock and hardered at seriously affected the morale of even Mehmed's battle-hardened army. In valley outside Tergovicit, Ladrud arranged the body approachings put up in Prenamits, Alburn laborers and Balbian Cladowns and collaborators on stakes. The forest of the impaled, which later accounts would describe as stretching over an area of roughly 3 kilometers in length and half in width. Width was a deliberate psychological weapon designed to communicate to the Ottoman army that the man they faced was and able to exceed any violence. Contemporary Ottoman sources describe Mehmed II himself, a man who had ordered massacres on a vast scale and who had razed Constantinople, expressing horror at what he saw. Some accounts describe him weeping. Whether these details are literally accurate, or at present literary embellishment of a genuine emotional response is impossible to verify. But the fact that even Ottoman source annalids has acknowledged his distress speaks to the extraordinary what Vlad had created. The army advanced. The psychological shock. Fountain vistas abandoned and continued into Wallachia, Alchia, without achieving a decisive engagement. Vlad continued his campaign, harassment, and attrition. The Ottomans eventually withdrew without having destroyed Vlad's forces or secured the principality. A strategic outcome that Vlad could count as a qualified success given the disparity in forces. His eventual defeat and imprisonment that same year, engineered, not the Ottomans, by his former ally, the Hungarian King King Matthias Corvinus. Reasons that were as much political as military did not diminish the fact that he had, in military terms, defended Wallachia against the most powerful army in Europe with a force of fraction in its size. Chapter 5 The Catalogue of Cruelties. What the sources? Cruelties? The rose and the thorns. In the ballad of Nada Arvlaltsa Vries se Sephicuris acts of cruelty comes primarily from a set of sources that must be treated with considerable historical care. The most lurid and detailed accounts are found in a series of German pamphlets printed in the years immediately following Vlad's imprisonment in 1 Flum 62 and 4 and 62. A remarkable fact in itself, since these pamphlets represent one of the earliest uses of the newly invented printing press for political propaganda purposes. These texts, printed in cities including Nuremberg, Bamberg, and Strasbourg, they were Sermsky, were Kaltid, Frauti, Cruelty. They were, by any reasonable historical assessment, significantly exaggerated in their details. But they were not entirely invented, and the specific acts they describe appear in enough independent sources to suggest its substantial or its core of historical truths underlies the embellishments. The German pamphlets describe Vlad burning people alive, boiling them in cauldrons, skinning off noses and ears and other body parts, and impaling men, women, and children in enormous numbers for offenses ranging from treason and collaboration and collaborants with the Ottomans to minor infractions of his code of justice. They describe him dining among foys of impaled bodies. allegedly remarking unpleasant on the pleasant smell of the rotting corpses. They describe him impaling Elihim, delegation of Aden ambassadors, through their heads when they refused to remove their turbans. It act, even if embellished, probably reflects a real incident based on Vlad's documented fury at Ottoman diplomatic discourtesy. They describe him nailing the hats of envoys to their heads when they refused to remove them as a mark of respect. The sources that are most favorable to Vlad, primarily Russian narratives in the late 15th century, portray him as a harsh, just ruler whose cruelties were directed against criminals, traitors, and the deserving. Also acknowledge a pattern of extreme violence, framing it positively. These Russian sources, which appear to have been based on an oral tradition in Yunwal, circulate and Walkaya and Moldavia, Vlad burning groups of the sick and poor who had come to him asking for relief, impaling merchants who cheated their customers, executing fire families for the crimes of numbers. In the Russian narrative tradition, these acts are presented as rulers, absolute justice and order. In the German Flit tradition, they are presented as evidence of demonic cruelty. The underlying acts are broadly similitudes. The stories that had ad thingum of historical truth among the many stories erratum attributed to Vlad III, astride to historians have identified a core of incidents that appear in multiple independent sources, that are consistent with the political and military logic of his situation, and that are therefore generally accepted as reflecting real events, even if specific details. The impalement of the Transylvanian Saxon merchants is one such episode. Vlad had serious conflicts with the Sanfliks, with its merchant communities of Brazov and Sav and Sibiu, and financing his rivals and conducting trade with Wallachia on terms that Vlad considered exploitative. His response was to launch raids in Saxon territory, burning villages and impaling the inhabitants in large numbers. The scale of these raids is documented in letters of complaint and Saxon towns to the Hungarian court, which provide an independent and corroborate of Vlad's violence, that is, free Vlad. The German pamphlets. The story of the Ottoman ambassadors and the turbans, in which Vlad, outraged by the ambassadors' refusal to remove their turbans in his presence, had the turbans nailed to their heads. Appears in multiple sources, including a Venetian report, which gives it a degree of independent corroboration. The story of Vlad testing his subjects' testing golden cup by in a public count an interrogationist that declaring that any theft of it would result in death, and that the cup was never stolen during his reign. Appears in both the Russian and German narrative traditions and is broadly consistent with the documented reality that leads men pressing in Walaya. However brutal the means, the total number of people killed under Vlad's orders during impossibles to establish if was contemporary estimates ranged from 20,000 to 100,000 and 100,000, and modern historians generally regard even the lower end estimates as likely exaggerated. The most careful historical scholarship suggests a total of perhaps 40,000 to 80,000 deaths over the course of his second reign, approximately 6 years. A figure that, while impossible to verify, is consistent with would have been required to achieved the political effects Vlad demonstrably achieved. What is beyond doubt is that he killed on a scale and in a manner that disgusted him, general elite, Miss Nulstern, Southeastern Europe. Chapter 6. The Warrior. Against the Ottomans, the night attack. Vlad's greatest military achievement, whatever history renders on Vlad as Vlad III. As a ruler, his military capabilities were genuine and considerable. The campaign of Borıng 62 against the Ottoman invasion led by Mehmed. He is studied by military historians as an example of asymmetric warfare and skill and strategic intelligence that was well ahead of its time. Vlad's decision to avoid pitched battle against a vastly superior force, a scorched earth policy, conduct raids designed to eliminate the enemy leadership, and to use psychological warfare on a systematic scale reflects military thinking of genuine sophistication. The bisensitive uppenhent of steering painterthief not the campaign was the night attack on the Ottoman camp that Vlad launched in June of that year, leading force launch a night 10,000 men. Vlad launched a night on the main Ottoman camp of killing Mehmed. The attack conducted in darkness. This and the penitment, penetrated deep in the Ottoman encampment, Borıng. E4, driven back. Mehmed escaped, apparently because Vlad's men attacked the wrong tent. The tents of the viziers Mum al-Pasha, Isaac Pasha, rather than the Sultan's own quarters. The attack killed significant numbers of Ottoman soldiers and could create an enormous confusion in the camp, but failed to achieve its primary objective. Even this failure, however, had unintended psychological effects. The knowledge that Vlad was willing and to attach a night attack on the heart of the Ottoman encampment with the specific intention of killing Sultan himself established a level of threat that complicated Ottoman operations. Throughout the campaign, Mehmed's eventual advance through Wallachia and his subsequent withdrawal were both influenced by the continued threat Vlad's mobile raiding forces and by the systematic destruction of food supplies that made sustained occupation of the country too costly to maintain. The betrayal of Matthias Corvinus, the end of Vlad's second reign, not the mambler of the military victory, threatened Engaris Porvia, the Hungarian King Matthias Corvinus, in late 1446, the withdrawing to St2. As the Ottomans were withdrawing from Wallachia, the Matthias arrived at the Waterlochen border with an army ostensibly to support Vlad's continued resistance Ottoman pressure. Instead, Matthias had Vlad arrested, charging him with treason and of his secret negotiations with the Ottomans. Charges most historians regard as fabricated or grossly distort. The real reasons for Matthias' betrayal of Vlad were almost certainly political and financial. Matthias' funds for the crusade against the Ottomans, funds that he appears have had no serious intention of using for that purpose, and needed to justify his failure to campaign by presenting an alternative narrative. Vlad, whose aggressive anti-Ottoman record made him an inconvenient reminder what crusading actually was all becoming politically problematic because of his conflicts with the Saxon merchant and communities of Transylvania, who were valuable economic play. All allies of Hungary, imprisoning Vlad and presenting him to Aziti as the which was the function of the German pamphlets that appeared at precisely this time served Matthias's political interests. Simultaneously, Vlad was held in varying degrees of comfortable captivity For approximately 12 years, from 462 to around 462 or 474 or 445. When 475, the conditions of his imprisonment were not those of a dungeon. He appears to have been held in relative comfort, converting to Catholicism during this period, a conversion that was probably politically motivated rather than spiritually profound, and eventually marrying a relative of Matthias Corvinus, possibly or illegitimate, with whom he had at least 2 sons. Chapter Op. 7. The Third Reign and the Final Darkness, Return and Death 1.76. 1 said to Intin Pin 75 or Foen Flay 5 or 76 or Want 476 or Poor Circumstance 6. Poor Circumstance stands in Kamshia. In Wakia has chucks once again to create opportunity for Vlad's return. The reigning Wallachian prince had proved insistent to Ottoman pressure, and both the Hungarians and the Moldavians, whose ruler, Stephen the Great, was Vlad's cousin, Storinge, saw advantage in restoring Vlad to the Wallon at a Wallachian throne as a more aggressive anti-Ottoman ruler. A military campaign was organized, and Vlad, now in his mids, took part in it. The campaign succeeded, and in a number for honor von 476, Vlad III became Prince of Wallachia for the 3rd time. His 3rd reign lasted approximately 2 months. The circumstances of his death ended in December 476, January or Sibsource, January Yuri 477, Churd Yuri Wari for 77, 70 are uncertain. The historical sources are fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, but the broad outlines are clear enough. His forces were engaged by an Ottoman-supported army ordered in an ambush or battle near Bucharest, Vest, and Vlad was killed. The most common account has him then dying in battle, either cut down while fighting or killed his own men in a moment of confusion. A Venetian report suggests he was decapitated and had Henston jewel where was displayed by Sultan Mehmed as proof of his enemy's death. He was approximately 45 or 46 years old. He had ruled Wallachia a total of 7 to 8 years across 3 reigns. He had survived Ottoman in captivity as a child, political exile in multiple courts, betrayal by his closest allies, and the systematic violence of one of the most known of dangerous prince environments in 15th century Europe. In death, as in life, he remained difficult to contain. His burial place is unknown. The various locations proposed by researchers. A monastery near Snagov Lake, a site in Bucharest, a location in Komanisti. All contested and none definitively confirmed. Even the ground would not settle the question of who he was and what. Chapter 8. The question of justice. Was Vlad the monster or defender? The Romanian national tradition in Romania, and particularly in the Voingia. Yet, the historical memory of Vlad III's very different from his image in the West. In the West, Romanian historical and law and prudential tradition has long viewed Vlad not primarily as a monster, as a defender of against Ants Arst, against Ottoman expansion. A harsh ruler whose methods, however extreme, were the product of a desperate situation, and whose ultimate objective of Wallachia as an independent Christian princeton. In this tradition, his cruelties are acknowledged but contextualized. He lived, he used brutal methods, but their brutality was purposeful and directed primarily against enemies of the state. Ottoman collaborators and elaborators, the corrupt nobility that had undermined Wallachian independence. There is genuine historical substance to this view. The pollution that Vlad Velast, one of the most demanding of any ruler in 5th, 10th Europe. The Ottoman threat was existential. Not merely a challenge, but a genuine danger of conquest and the end of an independent Christian Wallachia. The internal disorder created by the feuding boyar class was a real obstacle to effective resistance. Vlad's methods of addressing both problems, eliminating the untrust warrior class Kananakreskless, conducting an aggressive campaign against Ottoman collaborators and enemies were extreme but not irrational in their own terms, and the results he achieved were real. He maintained Wallachian independence, found for the duration of his second reign in circumstances where more conventional ruler had simply capitulated. The Romanian tradition also notes, with some historical justification, that the Liexter were directed against groups that were genuinely threatening to Wallachia's. The Ottoman collaborating nobility, the Transylvanian Saxon merchants who were financing his rivals, the Ottoman armies and their Bulgarian auxiliaries. the stories of indiscriminate cruelty toward ordinary Wallaceans. The burning of the sick, the punishment of minor offenses with death. Come primarily from the German pamphlets whose political agenda has been noted. And while they cannot be dismissed entirely, they need to be weighted appropriately. The historian's assessment, putting Vlad in context, any honest historical assessment of Vlad III must situate him in his time and place without either excusing Vin or caricaturing him into a cartoon villain. The 15th century was not gentle. The sack of Constantinople by the Ottomans, Iwarman free in 453 involved massacres on an enormous scale. The Hungarian campaigns against the Ottomans evolved atrocities curable in kind if not ones in scales. To Vlad's own actions, the contemporaneous Wars of Roses in Old England produced summary executions of captured nobles. The Spanish Inquisition, established in Tuatransuanthor 478, would torture and burn thousands of people over the following centuries. To hold Vlad III to standards of Kokanda that no ruler of Hal is ever met, while ignoring the violence of his contemporaries, is historically incoherent. What distinguishes Vlad from most of his contemporaries is not the fact of violence, but its scale, its systematic and alliterality. Most medieval rulers used violence instrumentally to defeat enemies, suppress rebellions, punish specific transgressions. Vlad used it instrumentally in these ways too, but also used it as communication and a performance on a scale and with a deliberateness that went beyond anything contemporaries were doing. The forest of the impaled outside Terragovevist in not merely an execution. It was a statement, a work of terrible art, a message addressed sarninously to the Ottoman army, to the Wallachian boyard, and to the broader world. This combination is of instrumental and communicative violence, orchestrated with precision and on an enormous scale, is what made Vlad III qualitatively different from the ordinary 15th century ruler. The question of whether he was mad, Mutin, whether his cruelage genuine psychological pathology rather than rational political calculation, is one that historians have debated and one that cannot be definitively answered from the surviving sources. The evidence is ambiguous. Many of his specific acts of cruelty can be rationalized and strategic terms, but the accounts of his behavior in certain contexts. The apparent pleasure he took in watching pink people suffer. The elaborate refinements of torture described in multiple sources. The dining among impaled bodies. Something beyond mere rational calculation, whether this represents the portrait of a genuine sadist or the embellishment of enemies to demonize him is a question that the historical record cannot definitively resolve. Oops, Chapter 9. From History to Legend. The birth of Vlad. How Vlad became a vampire. Prinslin Mayshao Li. Historial Vlam Foricumda da Vampiris Villa in the Vampire Calets La Vampire Dracula is one of the most remarkable acts of cultural transmutation in Western literary history. The connection between the historical Vlad Dracula and Bram Stoker's Brain 7 Jokers and Eat 97 novel is real but indirect. Indirect. Stoker borrowed the name Dracula from a work of Romanian history. He consulted while researching his novel, recognized its atmospheric, its bavasivric potential. It suggested both dragon and devil, and placed it on a character whose connection to the historical Vlad is limited. Then the name and a few atmospheric details. The vampire mythology that Stoker is not specifically associated with Vlad Romanian folk tradition. Essentially, Chile created the Korean through the creative act of writing the novel. The deeper question is why Vlad's name, and reputation were so readily available to receive mythological loading. Why? Who had died 400 years before Stoker's novel, still resonant enough in the cultural memory of Europe to serve as the basis for one of the most enduring villains in Western. The answer lies in the extraordinary effective of the German pamphlets of the Foix 60s and Foreign Sensis and Foin 20s and 170s and Chad teen 70s, which had established Vlad's reputation for supernatural seeming cruelty so firmly in the Western European imagine that it had Vlad entirely faded. Vlad Dracula was in some sense, a mythological figure before Stoker heard his name. A figure in whom the balance violence of her historical moment had crystallized into something that felt more than human. The vampire figure in Eastern European folk tradition does have some loose canonicals. Mere coincidence. The Slavic and Romanian vampire was understood an undead being that returned from the grave to prey on the living. Figures whose excessive violence or sinfulness life, the normal decomposition of death, and compelled it to sustain itself through the blood of others. Vlad's association with blood, the extraordinary blood, the quantities of it, and that he spilled during his lifetime, and the uncertainty about his place, and the possibility that he continued to haunt the political life of Wallachia even after his death, all fed into a cultural substrate in which the vampire legend could plausibly to his name. The legacy of horror, Vlad in the modern world, the novelant has become one of the most economically past in this life. Dracula has been the hundreds of films, thousands, game-less television series, video games, theme park attractions, and tourist enterprises in Romania, where the figure of Dracula, however inaccurate that the popular image has become one of the country's most significant tourist draws. The castle most frequently identified as Dracula's Castle, Brand Castle in Transylvania, Abria, was never actually badly inhabited by Vlad III, but it has attracted millions of visitors, drawn by the association with the legend, the actual historical Vlad III, as has said serious scholarlies that has past several decades significantly complicated the simple monster narrative. The publication of Radu Florescu and Raymond McNally's on the historical Dracula in the 1970s. The recovery, if there is a recovery, has continued to the present day. Romanian historians under the National Historical School by Monster by Western popular culture, have contributed significantly to a more nuanced, Mori Frunens Monster stating Flood's political context and the political motivations behind extreme accounts of his cruel Oat Chapter 10. For pairing the monsters of history's subtitle, given the lad to Vlad to Viver, Papier, Imagination, the cruelest ruler the world has ever known, invites a comparison that historians approach with appropriate caution. History has produced rulers whose body counts dwarf Vlad's. Tamerlane, who built towers of skulls from the cities conquered. Genghis Khan, whose campaigns killed millions across Asia and the Middle East. Stalin and Mao, whose decisions resulted in the deaths of tens of millions. By sheer numerical comparison, Vlad III was not history's recent killer of human beings. The total number of dubious is his orders, estimated by the most careful historical scholarship in the range of 40 to 80,000, is large by the standards of a small principality, but modest by the standards of the great empires. What makes Vlad's cruelty distinctive? And what has made it endure so powerfully in the historical and cultural memory of Europe is not but character, the deliberateness of his methods. That the theatrical quality of his violence, the evidence of something that went beyond rational calculation to genuine, systematic infliction of suffering for its suffering's own sake. These are qualities that distinguish him from the great killers of history. Operated at larger scale, but whose violence was primarily instrumental rather than performative. Vlad killed people in ways that maximized their suffering and his own control over that suffering, and he did so clearly, so publicly and repeatedly, and on a scale the honors a Presbyterian in his legion engine and time. He was also, paradoxically, in certain respects, an effective ruler. His campaigns against the Ottomans were skillfully conducted. Within and in Wallachia, created conditions of order and security, enforced by extreme terror, but real nonetheless, that his predecessors and successors did not achieve. The stories of the Golden Cup that was never stolen, of merchants who dared not their customers, of roads that as the safe to travel, because the consequences of crime were too terrible to contemplate, reflect a genuine social reality. Vlad's rule was effective at suppressing the ordinary crime and disorder that made life miserable for ordinary people in the Wallachia of his time. Whether the benefits of this order justified its costs is a moral calculation that different observers and across five and a half centuries since his death. The man behind the monster, what likes they're actually like. Actually, as a person, the historical sources give us glimpses, fragmentary, contradictory, filtered through the political agendas of those who recorded them. But a portrait of sorts emerges. He was clearly intelligent, strategically, possessed as of the convent and of the rest. He formally educated. He was formally educated at the Ottoman court, and in the Ottoman court, and gave him a knowledge of the world broader. The gnome could claim he was devoutly orthodox in his religious practice, endowing monasteries and and making leak donations to the church throughout his reign. And in his conversion to Catholicism during his Hungarian captivity, was generally regarded by contemporaries as politically motivated, rather vehement than sincere. He was capable of loyalty and certain Zen military commanders survived the full turbulent span of his career, and capable of a kind of rough justice that, within the severe parameters of his worldview, was consistently applied regardless of the social status of the offender. He was also, by any humane standard, for cruelties plitzflinies or excuse. The refinements of his methods of execution, the specific attention to maximizing suffering and duration of dying, the theatrical arrangements of the dead, the accuser's personal involvement in an apparent enjoyment of the process, speak to something in his character that goes beyond strategic calculation. The Ottoman court, where he spent his formative years, had taught him that power, without mercy, the form of power. The murders of his father and brother had taught them that the only reliable defense against violence for violence, whatever he might have been in it, if been different world. In the world he actually inhabited, these lessons combined to a ruler of a proletariat with we terror with a precision and on scale that has not been forgotten in 5 centuries. Vlad III Dracula died in the winter of 176 or 76 or 1/3 76 or for Bamber or ambush Hupush, whose precise circumstance are unknown. He was buried somewhere, perhaps Snagov, perhaps elsewhere, in a grave that has never been definitively located. His skull, if it was sent to Constantinople, as some sources claim, has never been found. He left sons whose names appear briefly in the records and then vanish. He left a principality within years of his death, fully absorbed into the Ottoman sphere of influence, the fifth he had spent his life fighting against. He left a name that has become synonymous in the popular imagination of the world with the darkest aspects of human nature. The capacity not merely to kill, but to kill with pleasure, systematically, theatrically, on a vast scale, as a statement about what power meant and what it could do. And he left a question that history has not resolved. Amps cannot. Whether a man who does months things in the service of genuinely important goals, the defense of his people, the the maintenance of order in a chaotic world, should be judged primarily by the things he did, or primarily by the goals he served. Romania has answered the question one way. Answered another. Empire, which feared him than any other enemy in that region in that century. And that century would have given a thorough answer, and perhaps all three answers are true Sanius. Which is why Vlad III Dracula remains. Which Vladila remains far enough Vefs. One of the most rebating Ispinvenpakmer of human power. Boon a plegua. The stake in the ground, why we remember there are hundreds of rulers in the history world who've killed more people or killed Vlad III. There are dozens whose methods were, in specific instances, as his. There are some whose deliberate cruelty, comparable, if cant or bore, if not always in theatrical elaborateness. And yet, Vlad III Dracula is the one whose name has become the global for monstrous cruelty. The monstrous cruelty. The one's story spawned the most enduring villain in Western popular culture. The one whose castle, even a castle that was never actually his, attracts millions of visitors every year. He is remembered because the combination of qualities he embodied, strategic intelligence, and systematic sadism, and performative brutality, genuine historical significance, and almost literary dramatic intensity, is extraordinarily the rare. Most monsters of history are simply powerful men who killed large numbers of people in pursuit of conventional ambitions. Vlad was something different. A man who appeared here to understand terror, orchestrated, was and communicated in that medium with a precision and on a scale that made his message forget the stake he drove into the ground outside Targovistat in the winter of 1462 with fixed each two, with the body of a Turkish soldier on it. The steka ser, the stentor of Avesad Okas Orest, Mizid Moore, was addressed to me you, every power that might think of threatening Wallachia, but it was also addressed to history, to the long memory of humanity, of humind, that recognizes extreme violence as highlands, as a kind of signature, the mark of a personality so far outside the normal range that it demands to be remembered. Only because forgetting it might mean failing to recognize it when it appears again. Vlad Dracula has not been forgotten. He will not be. The stake remains in the ground